My name is Vike Martina Plock. I'm Professor of Modern Literature and Culture at the University of Exeter. I'm also Head of English at the University of Exeter. On the 26th of September, I gave a talk at the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution about James Joyce's Ulysses. Unfortunately, the first part of the talk wasn't recorded, so I'm trying to re-record my opening remarks so they can be added to the rest of the talk. I began by suggesting that this is a very important year for Joyce scholars because 100 years ago, Joyce published Ulysses, his masterpiece, in Paris. To be more precise, he published it on the 2nd of February 1922, his birthday. The book was published in a limited deluxe edition by an American expat called Sylvia Beach, the owner of an avant-garde bookshop, Shakespeare and Company. Some of you might have heard that name. So, and this is a book that comes with a particular kind of reputation. It's often quoted, loads of writers refer to it. I think there's no 20th century or 21st century major writer who will not claim that in one way or another they've been influenced by Joyce. It's sort of a desert island book. Everybody names it as the one they would take onto desert island. But it's a book that is more often spoken about than being read. And I think at this point, early in the talk, I asked the audience how many had actually read Ulysses or how many of them had tried to read Ulysses. There were a few hands, and some members of the audience suggested that they had tried, but didn't necessarily get very far. At this point, I tried to reassure them and said that there are apparently statistics on where readers drop out. So the third chapter is one of those big hurdles. You might get to the first and the second chapter. I think that's fine. Live with this. And then you come to the third chapter, which deals with Stephen Dedalus walking along the beach. And this is often a place where loads of readers, first-time readers, give up. The next hurdle would then be chapter 7, the so-called A-list chapter, then chapter 11, and so forth, so on and so forth.
That's fine. So you might remember that there were certain places where it got more difficult, certain chapters that seemed more challenging than others. Believe it or not, there are actually statistics on where people tend to drop out, where first-time readers tend to drop out. So if you made it past chapter 3, you're doing extremely well. That's the chapter when Stephen walks on the beach. That is a very, very challenging one. If you made it then beyond chapter 7, you're doing even better. That's the one with the newspaper headlines, and so on and so forth, right? So people have spent quite a bit of time analyzing a first-time reader's response to the text. Joyce, as you might know, didn't make things easier for us. He said at some point about Ulysses that, quote, "I've put in so many enigmas and puzzles that it will keep the professors busy for centuries arguing over what I meant. And that's the only way of ensuring one's immortality." So what do we do with that? We're certainly right. Here we are, 100 years on, we're still arguing about what he might have meant. In June, more than 200 academics gathered in Dublin to celebrate Bloomsday and the centenary of Ulysses, still arguing what he might have meant. Obviously, many more people gathered outside in the streets of Dublin, the general public, again celebrating this amazing book that Joyce has given us. So, what do we want to do today? I wanted to suggest that I'll start by introducing different ways of reading Ulysses. So I'm going to explore how we might begin to read Ulysses, and I also hint at as why Joyce might still be relevant today. But I'd be very interested to hear your views, why you think maybe why Joyce is still relevant 100 years on. If we have a bit of time later on, we might even be doing some close reading. So have a bit of fun with the text and see what we can do with Joyce's fabulously experimental novel. Okay, so and that's where your handout comes in. But on to, just a general sort of quick introduction to the text. It is perfectly possible to read Joyce's text for the plots and, for the characters and the things that are actually depicted in the. Oops, that was the one. Yeah, no, that's the one. I wanted the events that are depicted in the novel. So I already suggested the novel is set in a particular day in Dublin on the 16th of June 1904. Joyce wrote it actually between 1914 and 1921 when he was living in different European cities. So he was writing really very much from memory. Writing about Dublin, his hometown, and the people who inhabited it while he was elsewhere in different European cities. I'll come back to that later on. We have three protagonists. The first one, the most important one, is Leopold Bloom. We got an image here from one of a graphic novel rendition of the novel, first image that we received of Leopold Bloom in Ulysses. So Leopold Bloom is a middle-aged, middle-class, married man with one daughter. He also has a son who died in infancy, and this trauma is something that Bloom carries around with him, I think, throughout, and we encounter this trauma throughout the day. He works in advertising, and he's got Jewish heritage. So, and this is really, I think, very significant, very interesting. It makes him immediately an outsider figure in the kind of social circles that he moves in Dublin. Joyce said once that Bloom for him was such a satisfying character because he was a complete character. He's a son, a husband, a father. He's very immersed in socioeconomic life of Dublin, in the world he lives in. So that's why Joyce suggested he liked Bloom. He was an all-round complete character. When we first see him, he prepares breakfast for his wife, Molly Bloom. And this is already quite interesting because it might suggest a reversal of traditional gender roles. Immediately before we meet, even we have know anything about the Blooms, we start his day and we watch him prepare breakfast for Molly, who's still lying in bed. So Bloom is this complete all-round character, and yet, as those of you who've read Ulysses will know, he's also an outsider figure. At some point during the day, he is subjected to an anti-Semitic verbal assault. And I think this is of interest for reading Joyce, because Joyce is obviously writing about Bloom at a time when anti-Semitism was on the rise, and also when many of his contemporaries, other modernist writers, we now are very conscious of the fact that they have very problematic politics. I've given you here as an example the image of the old Ezra Pounds having debates with the statue on James Joyce's grave in Zurich. I'm not sure what he mentions they're talking about. It's literature, aesthetics, politics. We just take Pound as an example. You might know that Pound began or developed a very unfortunate appreciation for Italian fascism. T.S. Eliot, even Virginia Woolf, are now known for having very often problematic politics. And I think Joyce is interesting because of his ability to write with insight and compassion about individuals who inhabit these kind of outsider positions at a time when this was not necessarily something that was acceptable or accepted. And this might be also a reason why his novel deserves rereading today, 100 years after it was published. Now, the second protagonist we encounter in Ulysses is Stephen Dedalus, and he will be familiar to many readers, first-time readers of Ulysses, who certainly probably have encountered him elsewhere. So Joyce resurrects Stephen from a portrait of the artist as a young man. Just quickly, hands up again. Portrait of the Artist, that's probably the novel that's more familiar. Yes, I see a few hands. Good. Yes, fabulous. Okay, good. So those of you who read A Portrait of the Artist as a young man know that it ends on a very optimistic note. Stephen is often regarded as a thinly disguised version of the young Joyce, a young artist figure, as the title of the novel implies. And at the end of the novel, Portrait of the Artist as a young man, we see him leave Dublin, he leaves and he goes to Paris and he wants to become an artist. And the novel ends on a very optimistic note. So I've just given you some passages from the end, very, very famous passages from a portrait. Quotes, and he says this in the first part, he says in a conversation with a friend, "I will not serve that in which I no longer believe, whether it calls itself my home, my fatherland, or my church, and I will try to express myself in some mode of life or art as freely as I can and as wholly as I can, using for my defense the only arms I allowed myself to use, silence, exile, and cunning." And then a very famous ending. "Welcome, O life. I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of life." And off he goes to Paris. And when we re-encounter Stephen in Ulysses, he is very much disgruntled, disenchanted. He has been really returned to Dublin, where he now works as a supply teacher in a local primary school. So things haven't gone too well with Stephen. And his mood isn't very good. This is the kind of famous, I guess, Icarus narrative that is indicated in his last name. So Stephen Dedalus, right? He flew too high and yes, things didn't end so well with Stephen. Generally, we might say that there's a particular optimistic narrative that can be constructed in reading Ulysses. This is a particular kind of interpretation that the early Joyce reception really focused on, and it goes as follows. The encounter between Bloom and Stephen is somewhat transformative for both of them. So these two protagonists at some point meet towards the end of the novel. The suggestion is that Stephen is some kind of surrogate son for Bloom, who's lost his young son, and Stephen finds in Bloom some kind of spiritual father, right? So the encounter is productive, especially so because Joyce was thinking of Bloom and representing the scientific elements in life, so that's what he represents, whereas Stephen Dedalus represents the artistic components of life. So in that their meeting, it's really that moment where opposites meet, and this is why this encounter is so productive. And it suggests that yes, this encounter between those two protagonists is transformative for both of them. There are certain problems with this narrative, mostly because, yes, they do meet. They return to Bloom's house, and Bloom makes them a cup of cocoa that they drink, and they have conversation about life and all sorts of different things. But then at the end of the penultimate episode of the novel, Stephen just walks off into the night. We just don't know if he ever will come back, right? So we might not know if their encounter will have a sequel. So that's a big question mark. So as you can see, it's a suggestion that maybe there is something that is positive about their encounter, but Joyce refuses to give us that sense of conclusion that I think we would very much like as readers. So it's slightly frustrating in many ways. What we get instead at the very end of Ulysses is the so-called Penelope episode. And this is where we then finally meet our third protagonist, and that is Molly Bloom, who is Leopold Bloom's wife. So Joyce called the final episode, the Penelope episode, the clue of the book. And how we often read this as in Joyce criticism is that this is the moment where Molly Bloom offers a response to everything that's gone on before. Throughout the day, we've seen her, we've heard loads of things about her through Bloom's stream of consciousness, through other mostly male members of the Dublin society. And when we come to the very end of the book, it's finally Molly's turn to set the record straight. So she responds to many of the accusations, rumors that have been circulating about her in this very final passage in the book. We should say here, very important for the plot, we know for sure that on the 16th of June, 1904, Molly begins an affair with another man called Blazes Boylan. They have an assignation for 4 o'clock that afternoon. And one of the interesting things is, and one thing that Joyce scholars endlessly, kind of a puzzle, I suppose, that the Joyce scholars endlessly come back to is as to why Bloom isn't preventing it. He's very aware of the fact that Molly is going to have this affair with Blazes Boylan. He doesn't prevent it. He lets it happen. Lets it get on with it. So there's this sort of mystery here at the heart of the book and the heart of their relationship, which endlessly fascinates Joyce scholars. But the point really is that it's quite remarkable that Joyce decided to give a woman the final words in this really, really big book. And there's also one reason why I think many feminist scholars are extremely interested in Ulysses, because there might be a lot of potential in developing feminist readings of especially the last chapter of the book, but the novel more generally. I've given you an image here on the slide, Marilyn reading James Joyce's Ulysses, and if you look very, very closely, you can see that Marilyn reads the Penelope episode. She's at the very end of the book, right? You can probably just about see that. And I've given you that image because even if you haven't read Ulysses, thinking of Marilyn Monroe, you might have a sense of what kind of image of femininity Joyce is presenting to the world in writing the Penelope episode. So we've got the image of voluptuous, sexy womanhood that he's describing through, the interior monologue of Molly Bloom. Molly isn't blonde; she's dark-haired, but nonetheless, think of Marilyn Monroe, and you have maybe a good sense of what Molly Bloom, or how Joyce might have imagined Molly Bloom and how he presented her, right? Feminist critics have felt that there are some problems, obviously, with that kind of representation of femininity, although some have also seen potential in the way he describes women. Someone who is very, very affirmative or supportive of Joyce's depiction of femininity was the very eminent psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung. And on the slide here you can see a section from a letter that he wrote to Joyce in the 1930s from Küsnacht in Zurich, from 32. And so he admits that he found it really, really difficult to come to terms with Ulysses, but he's finally had a go, and now he's writing Joyce an appreciation. So he says, "Dear Sir, your Ulysses has presented the world such an upsetting psychological problem that repeatedly I've been called in as a supposed authority on psychological matters. So Jung is now giving advice on how to read a literary text, or the kind of characters that Joyce made up. I think it's really fascinating." And he continues, "Ulysses proved to be an exceedingly hard nut, and it has forced my mind not only to most unusual efforts, but also to rather extravagant peregrinations, speaking from the standpoint of a scientist. Your book as a whole has given me no end of trouble, and I was brooding over it for about 3 years until I succeeded to put myself to it. But," he continues, "I must tell you that I'm profoundly grateful to yourself as well as to your gigantic opus, because I learned a great deal from it." And now comes the important bit. He says, "The 40 pages of non-stop run in the end is a string of veritable psychological peaches. I suppose the devil's grandmother knows so much about the real psychology of a woman." And this is from one of the leading psychological experts of its time, of Joyce's time, congratulating Joyce on his depiction of femininity. So if that doesn't make you curious, if you haven't had a look at Ulysses, please, now I highly recommend, starting immediately with the final chapter of Ulysses, having a go. Perfectly fine. I'll come back to the reading in sequence, the idea of reading the Ulysses in sequence later on. So Nora Barnacle, Joyce's partner, who lived with him throughout most of their adult life, and followed him around to various different European cities, had her own comment on how well Joyce knew women. She said at some point, Jim doesn't know the first thing of women. So take your pick, okay? But I think the main point really to emphasize is here that the depiction of gender and gender roles in Ulysses is very, very interesting. And there's still a lot of interest in just returning to the question of representations of not just femininity, but also masculinity. There's a fair bit of cross-dressing going on in that episode. Where gender identities also become extremely fluid. So plenty of opportunities to return to the text now, where we also find probably that we return to questions of gender repeatedly, and have revisit some of these particular debates. Okay, so these are just some introductory remarks about the characters, some of the plot lines that we discover in Ulysses. I want to talk a little bit about the formal and also the literary elements of the book. And here we can begin to think of the so-called Homeric parallels or the Homeric references. So we can start with the title, Ulysses. Does anyone know exactly what it means out of interest? That's yes, yeah. It's Odysseus. It's the Latin, version of Odysseus, precisely Odysseus, and that is already very significant. So immediately, just by the choice of the title, Joyce indicates that that sort of intertextual playfulness of the novel, the relationship between his Ulysses, and Homer's Odyssey. He also seems to again make his arrogance blatantly obvious, right? He's suggesting that he is writing a modern day epic that is as important as Homer's Odyssey, right? But again, this is a starting point for some really interesting interpretations of the text that we can develop. And someone who was extremely interested in this was T.S. Eliot. He wrote a very short essay called Ulysses, Order and Myth in 1923, shortly after he published The Wasteland. And he really liked the way in which Joyce used these Homeric references throughout the text. And he suggested this was something that he himself, T.S. Eliot, called the mythical methods. So he said, in using the myth, in manipulating a continuous parallel between contemporaneity and antiquity, Mr. Joyce is pursuing a method which others must pursue after him. It is simply a way of controlling, of ordering, of giving a shape and a significance to the immense panorama of utility and anarchy which is contemporary history. Instead of narrative methods, we may use the mythical method. It is, I seriously believe, a step towards making the modern world possible. Arts. So Eliot suggests here that arts can be some kind of structuring device that can give shape to the chaos of modern existence. So Eliot liked structure. He really, really liked that kind of idea of structure. It's like that he likes things to be very, very neat. Joyce is a bit messier, but still, he does use these Homeric references throughout the text. Sometimes for comic effect, sometimes to underline some parallels between the Odyssey and his own text. But there's a lot of fun to be had. If you're familiar with the Odyssey, you can use that as a starting point to read Ulysses. We can have a look at this in a little bit more detail. And this is now on your handout, the first page on your handout. You see the so-called Lenati schema, or the Gilbert-Gorman plan. I hope you can either read it on the screen, or I hope it's light enough so you can see it on your handout. So what we have got here is it looks like a map that you can use to read Ulysses. This is a guide that Joyce gave to actually two different critics. He gave two slightly different maps to two different people. They're mostly similar. There's some differences. Anyhow, so he provided some of his early critics with this map, which he suggested was some kind of reading tool that is useful to make sense of Ulysses. Some critics suggest that towards the end of the writing process, Joyce got very, very worried because he was worried that no one would really understand what he was trying to do. So he drew up this map and suggested to some of the early critics on how to start a literary discourse about his text. So this is where it comes from. So as you can see, we've got 18 different episodes. So from Telemachus to Penelope, these are the individual chapter names, the Homeric references, clear. We've got a scene, hour, organ, art, color, symbol, and I can't see that as technique, I think, at the very end. So Joyce seems to have allocated a scene clearly, an hour, but sometimes an organ, an art, a color, a symbol to all of the episodes that we encounter in the book. Okay? So the titles obviously further reference particular sections from the Odyssey and seem to be invitations to the reader to think about the parallels between the Odyssey and Ulysses. So I already suggested sometimes Joyce seems to invert certain Homeric plot lines. We might just think of Penelope, Molly Bloom. So I think Molly Bloom is not necessarily the faithful stay-at-home wife. She stays at home. She doesn't really leave the house, but she's certainly not faithful. Right? Joyce has a bit of fun with, the inversion of this particular Homeric narrative. At this point, I would like to just draw your attention to the fact that the novel has two beginnings. I suggested earlier on that you might just start reading the novel by, turning immediately to the final chapter. If you look at this Gilbert-Gorman plan, the Linati schema, as it often is referred to, you see that the first and the fourth chapter, Telemachus and Calypso, the hour is 8 o'clock. Okay, so it's an invitation. If you wanted to, you can start reading chapter 4, which is the first Leopold Bloom chapter. Chapters 1, 2, 3 are Stephen Dedalus chapters. In fact, when I teach Ulysses at the university, I often begin at chapter 4 because for students, it's a much better way into the novel. Once you've encountered some of the narrative techniques that Joyce is using, you familiarize yourself a little bit with the world that Joyce is depicting, and become familiar with Bloom, then it's a good time to go back and face Stephen Dedalus. So that's something that I highly recommend in case you wanted to have a go at it. Chapter 4 is a much better place to start, obviously. And clearly, as we can see here, Joyce has also provided some kind of symbolic infrastructure for the novel. So we can look at, for instance, the episode number 7, Ulysses. This is as many of you will know, a chapter that's set in a newspaper office, and it's a chapter that also then suddenly gets, introduces these looks like headlines in the middle of the text. So you can just probably see here, right? So somehow the text suddenly begins maybe to look a bit like a newspaper, or is it mirroring the appearance of a newspaper? Right? So Joyce is doing something really interesting and experimental with the form of the novel when we come to this particular chapter. When we look at the Linati schema, we can also see that the Ulysses, so you might know then from, again, thinking of the Homeric reference, Ulysses is the god of wind, the organs, lungs, and the art. Sorry, I'm just kind of have to go back now and remind myself. Art is rhetoric, exactly. Yes. So you might start thinking, right, even before having had a go at this episode, what Joyce might be doing in bringing all these different aspects together: the god of winds, the lungs, then the idea of rhetoric. The text itself, when we come to the episode, we see that loads of political speeches are recited in the episodes. So Joyce might be saying something about the effects of journalism, of political oratory, something like that, is recirculated like hot air, something like that. You might say something about the lack of impact of words, potentially, in this chapter. That might be one starting point, even before you've started reading it. So with the Linati schema, you can already begin to come to certain interpretations of the text, right? Even before you get started. I made a terrible fool of myself once when talking about this particular episode in an introductory lecture to Joyce at University College Dublin, when I said, well, sometimes these associations seem quite random, and here's one of them, because then I pointed out that I wasn't quite sure why Joyce assigned the colour red to this particular episode. And I said this in front of a full lecture theatre. And then obviously afterwards, it was a mature student who then came to me and said, I think I know. So I'm just wondering if someone knows. Quite, prize question. Anyone has any idea why, even if you don't know anything about the episode, colour red?
Is it the plant? Was it the colour?
Yes. Oh, thank God. It makes me feel so much better. It's a saying about newspapers, black, white and red. That's what he was going for, the homonym. You're not thinking about the colour red. He's thinking about red, the past tense of to read. He's just having a bit of fun. That's just Joyce. That's just a little pun that he introduces here. At least this makes sense. When the student told me, I thought, yeah, that sounds like Joyce. Just sounds like Joyce. Just building in, a little sort of puzzle for readers to solve. Not, even when he was writing this plan, this guide that was supposed to help us reading Ulysses, he's just having a little bit of fun, right? So, that's, again, one particularly good example of maybe, suggesting that we can use this guide as a starting point for reading Ulysses, but we mustn't probably think that this will somehow unlock all the mysteries of the text, right? So it's a good guide to have, but also I would say feel free to abandon it when you feel like it just doesn't work, it doesn't mean anything to me. That's absolutely fine. So that they are, it is actually really extremely useful. I should say that a friend of mine, the commissioning editor of the James Joyce Quarterly, so the flagship journal of Joyce studies, told me once that he is very wary of these essay submissions that he sometimes receives, and he gets them quite frequently when authors suggest that they've solved the mystery of Ulysses. And then the key is usually number 5 or something like that. And it's not quite that simple, right? So, but I think this is the kind of text that invites these kind of readings. Anyhow, so the Linati schema is a very, very good place to go, thinking of the Homeric references that Joyce is developing in the text. The symbolic infrastructure, can have a lot of fun just thinking about those particular references. Now, another way of reading Joyce's Ulysses is the relationship between the Irish and the international Joyce. So Joyce says that he was writing the novel with such attention to detail that if Dublin were to be erased from the face of the earth, it could be rebuilt with just his novel as a guide. So that's the kind of amount of, that's the kind of the level of detail he invested in writing it. So he is obviously very committed to representing the life of his contemporaries and life of Dubliners, ordinary Dubliners in the novel. So that's why obviously it's clear that he's conventionally regarded as an Irish writer. But the interesting thing is that the book does not end on Molly Bloom's final and orgasmic yes, as it's often claimed, but it ends on these words: Trieste, Zurich, Paris, 1940 to 1941. So Joyce acknowledges at the end of the novel that the text was written in exile. He was writing it while he was, moving around different European cities during and after the First World War. So he was living a very peripatetic life. Also at a time when the cartographic landscape of the European continent changed quite significantly. So it's probably very understandable that Joyce is often also claimed as a writer who is very, very international in outlook, is very, very cosmopolitan. And somehow these kind of readings of Joyce sometimes are in conflict with one another. But it's clearly the case that he wanted to make Dublin and ordinary people and in his hometown the centre of his novel. Also interesting is the fact that Joyce set the novel in 1904, but so before the Easter Rising, 1916, but the novel was completed, completely finished in 1921. So, during the War of Independence and obviously, before the Republic of Ireland came into existence. And what that means is that it is expressive of a particular kind of moment before these revolutionary activities took place. But Joyce writes with the knowledge of these events. So it means that he foreshadows some of these historical moments in the novel that is set in an earlier decade. So some events seem to be referenced, even though they haven't taken place. People mentioned who would come to prominence during the Easter Rising, during the War of Independence, for instance. Arthur Griffiths is mentioned several times in Ulysses. And generally, I think Joyce is very, very interested in exploring Ireland's de facto colonial situation. That is an underlying narrative in the novel. So this is why Ulysses is a very, very political book, or at least a book that reflects on the complexities of contemporary colonial politics. It doesn't necessarily give us any answers, but it just reflects on these problematic the problems of British colonial rule in Ireland. And here we can turn to Stephen Dedalus very briefly, who famously says in a conversation with a young Englishman, quote, "I'm the servant of two masters," Stephen said, "an English and an Italian." Italian, Haynes said, so Haynes is the Englishman, and Stephen responds, "The Imperial British State is colorizing, and the Holy Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church." Okay, so Joyce is very mindful to the particular complexities that arise out of the colonial situation, and obviously, as we know, we still somehow live with the legacy of these historical complexities, even now 100 years after Joyce published his novel. Okay, so this might give you some good reasons why the text is still worth reading today. I wondered, how are we doing for time? Should we maybe do a bit of close reading and have a bit of fun with the text? How do you feel about that? Does that sound alright? Maybe see what we can do? Yeah? Okay, super. Oops, there's some bit missing. I hope you can, that long section, don't worry, I'll read it, is on your handout. Just flip it over. Okay? Just very briefly, I could have picked out any passage from Ulysses. Plenty of things that we could have done. This is not necessarily a very famous passage, but I think a very good one to show that Joyce is really trying to give us a flavour of Dublin city life, and this is also a text passage in which, as I suggested earlier on, he picks up on some of the historical complexities arising of the Irish colonial situation. Okay, it comes from the so-called Wandering Rocks episodes. If you go back to your Linati's schema, it's episode 10, and you can now check about the references, the symbols, the organs, all of it. It's usually seen or read as the chapter in which Dublin, the city itself, becomes the protagonist of the text of the novel. So there are several mini sections that spotlight different people at different places in Dublin. Okay, and this part here, this long section, is from the final part. And what we see here, broadly speaking, is a cavalcade that makes its way through Dublin, and it seems is greeted by loads of bystanders. And it is the Lord Dudley, who is the representative of the British monarch in Ireland, is on his way through Dublin. Okay, and yes, and this is the section that seems to try to capture his passage through Dublin. So I just need to see. I haven't got it properly in front of me. Thank you, because I can't see it. Thank you. Thanks, Ian. Okay. So here we go. The cavalcade passed out by the lower gate of Phoenix Park, saluted by obsequious policemen, and proceeded past Kingsbridge along the northern quays. Viceroy was most cordially greeted on his way through the metropolis. At Bloody Bridge, Mr. Thomas Kernan, beyond the river, greeted him vainly from afar. Between Queen's and Whitworth bridges, Lord Dudley's vice-regal carriages passed and were unsaluted by Mr. Dudley White, B.L. M.A., who stood on Arran Quay outside Mrs. M.E. White's, the pawnbroker, at the corner of Arran Street, where, stroking his nose with his forefinger, undecided whether he should arrive at Phillipsborough more quickly by a triple change of tram, or by hailing a cab, or on foot for Smithfield, Constitution Hill, and Broadstone Terminus. In the porch of Four Courts, Richard Golding, with his coast bag of Golding, Collis, and Ward, saw him with surprise. Past Richmond Bridge, at the doorstep of the office of Reuben J. Dodds, solicitor, agent for the Patriotic Insurance Company, an elderly female about to enter, changed her plan, and, retracting her steps by King's window, smiled courteously on the representative of His Majesty. From its sluice in Wood Quay, wall under Thomas Devon's office, Poodle River hung out in Belty, a town of liquid sewage. Above the cross-blind of the Ormond Hotel, gold by bronze, Miss Kennedy's head by Miss Deuce's head, watched. On Ormond Quay, Mr. Simon Dennis, steering his way from the greenhouse to the sub-sheriff's office, stood still in mid-street and brought his head low. His Excellency graciously returned Mr. Dennis's greeting. Okay, what is going on here? It's a lengthy passage. I'm sorry that I put you through this. Prophecy, the question might be, the way we might want to start reading this passage is by thinking about what is the text seem to be trying to capture here. What kind of text might this be? What kind of text could it be? What do you think? Where might you find this kind of text?
If I can speak, yeah, it's satirical.
Of course, yes.
Way that you see a newspaper. It's also satirical on the bourgeoisie.
Okay, go on. Yeah, go on. Have you got a particular example in mind there? That's absolutely right.
I had two Irish grandparents who were living in Dublin.
Yes. Oh, really? Fabulous. Yes. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
But my understanding is that Joyce goes through various ways of writing.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes he does it in a satirical way, like alcohol writing.
Yes.
You know.
Yes.
And this seems to be an example where he would have taken it. If we were now commentary on a state wedding. Or
yes. Or a visit.
What winds it all in is people who look at are bourgeoisie who enjoy it. You know, and that's all I've got to say, really.
Yeah, that's fine. Yes, brilliant. Lots of interesting information there. It seems obviously a text that seems to mimic, as you suggest, a newspaper report of a particular high-profile, high-society event, right? That seems to be the language that the text seems to aspire to. It tries to sort of try to get to that register, but there is already satire here. It seems as if the text itself, there's a certain rebellious energy, as if that sort of desire is somehow undermined. You might have found this when reading this. It's sometimes more difficult to point your finger how exactly it does work. But I think that's a good starting point. We have a text that tries to pretend like a newspaper article, reporting on this high important event. The representative of the British monarchy on his way through Dublin is saluted by all the loyal subjects. And it's not quite as easy as that. Something else is happening. We might think about who is actually offering greetings. What are other people doing here? Has anyone noticed anything here?
Appears the Olympic surveys are that range.
What does that do there, for instance? Right? Yes, precisely. That's where really things fall apart, right? That's really the text doesn't seem to be able to hold it together. That narrative that it really tries so hard to construct, it completely falls apart. But it disintegrates before, right? Before we even come to that. Is anyone else something else that they noticed?
It's the long passage.
Yes, precisely. So we have this very lengthy deliberation how Mr. Dudley White will get to Phipsborough here, whether he goes this way or that way, endless ruminations on this. And the interesting thing is the sentence becomes as circuitous, right? So syntactically, the text enacts that indecision, right, of this particular person who is completely, that the fact that the viceroy is just passing here is completely irrelevant, right? But it's funny that the text seems to want to record this in the desire to present this straightforward narrative. Everybody's greeting Lord Dudley, right? Everybody has to be included, right? And this is somehow not quite the case. It's very good. Mr. Dudley is obviously included because of the name, right? He obviously shares the name with Lord Dudley. That seems to be the reason why he's selected, strangely enough, in this list of people who, it turns out, don't actually salute viceroys. There are some of them that do, but most of them seem indifferent or seem with surprise. Okay? So you see, Joyce is already having a lot of fun with this kind of straightforward standard narrative that is developed here. Sort of loads of sarcasm and irony here. There's one curious case though. If you look at the ends, there's one person, it seems, who does greet Lord Dudley very clearly. I've already suggested it seems to completely fall apart when we get to the sewerage, but then it seems to end on the note of someone who clearly seems to greet Lord Dudley, and that is Mr. Simon Dedalus. And certainly this is the way in which how His Excellency interprets the gesture. Mr. Simon Dedalus brings his head low. His Excellency graciously returns Mr. Dedalus's greeting. It seems at the very end of the passage, we're back in this dominant narrative, newspaper reports of a high society event. Okay, but there's something wrong. Yes, exactly.
And if you take it to
yes. We should be careful. The point is still absolutely valid. It's not Stephen, it's Simon Dedalus. So it's Stephen's father. But the point is still, that is even more important. Anyone remember anything about Simon Dedalus, maybe from reading a portrait of the artist as a young man, a Christmas dinner scene? I don't know. Anybody else? Yes, of course. Fervent home rule supporter. In the funeral chapter, chapter 6, Ulysses, Hades. So the passage is set in a graveyard. Simon is there with his friends. They pay a visit to the chief, so they pay a visit to Parnell's grave. So there's no way, absolutely no way, that Simon Dedalus would ever greet a representative of a British monarch. Something is very wrong here. Well, that's always a very good explanation. With Simon Dedalus, that is probably the case. Even then, I think he wouldn't go that far. Absolutely not. This text passage, or this particular episode in Ulysses' Wandering Walks, is often referred to as the chapter that looks at reader traps. There we have a really big reader trap here. So I don't expect anyone to know the answer to it. It's very comical, I think, and very simple when you know something about Dublin in 1904. We need to look at the section in a little bit more detail. So Simon Dedalus is coming from Ormond Quay. And where does he come from exactly? Yes, a greenhouse in Dublin is not a greenhouse from the way we understand it. Again, I just wonder if anyone has that kind of local knowledge. No, that's fine. That's fine. Don't think that I knew that. Years of diligent Joyce studies, finally make me understand this. In 1904, a greenhouse in Dublin is a name for public urinal. Can someone now tell me what really happened?
Mid-street.
He stood still in mid-street and bowed his head low. No, not quite. No, it's not quite like that. But what's happened? He forgot to his flies. Yes, noticed it, and then quickly try to remedy the matter. So that's what really happens. And you might say this is just Joyce again having a bit of fun and, misdirecting readers, right? But the interesting thing is the way the text reports it and the effect that this gesture has on here His Excellency, who clearly misreads the gesture, graciously returns the greeting, right? Misreads it, completely misunderstands it. The joke is on, Lord Dudley, right? The interesting thing is also probably only people with local knowledge who get the joke, right? So Joyce writes this very clearly with a particular audience in mind. People who grew up in Dublin, ordinary people in Dublin who would get the joke, right? It's a sort of insider joke. And he's writing this, again, to insert a bit of sort of rebellious energy into this text, right? That is trying to challenge the authority of, the dominant narrative, which suggests that in Ireland, everything is well with colonial rule, right? So that's really how this particular text passage works, okay? And yes, so this is just a little bit of fun you can have with close reading the text when you look at the text in detail. I think I'm going to stop here because we might want to leave some time for questions or comments or conversations. Is that all right? Yeah? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vika. So we have time for Q&A, although you've obviously already warmed up the audience and there's been back and forth on Zoom. One thing because we've got a good number online as well, we're going to do a little bit of we're going to use the microphone, and if you could sort of repeat the question in case it isn't heard. But any questions from the floor to start? I have loads, but that's my prerogative, but I will not take the floor. Questions? I will dash over and look at the Zoom in a moment, but okay, we'll start here. So
You suggested you were going to propose some order of reading, or was it simply the business to start on the chapter?
Yeah, so that's one way of thinking about the order. Sorry, I forgot. I need to repeat the question. Apologies. So the question here was, or the suggestion was that I would propose some order of reading. And the question was whether this was just a suggestion to start in chapter 4. So that's the most obvious thing to do if you wanted to make it a little bit easier for yourself. Start in chapter 4. It's perfectly possible, and this is the good thing about Ulysses, to read just individual episodes in isolation. That's perfectly possible. There's some really good guides, introductory guides. I've got one in particular in mind that I can recommend to anyone who's interested, that can be used to do this. But for a first-time reader who wants to find an easy way into the text, that will be, yes, chapter 4 first, 4, 5, 6, and then you can go to chapter 1, 2, 3, and then return to chapter 7 if you still haven't had enough of the size. So yes, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. Okay?
Thank you very much. Too many questions. But one question that came to mind was Wandering Rocks.
Yes.
Is that, as far as I know, that's not in the Odyssey.
Yes.
It is introduced in its aspect of linking points in space and time across the any thoughts why he chooses to do that there with the ending of His Excellency graciously returns Mr. Davis's greeting? Does that have any meaning?
So that's various things. So first of all, the question was, or the comment was quite rightly that in the Odyssey we don't get wandering rocks because Odysseus has a choice to go between two different routes, wandering rocks and skill interrupters, and he chooses skill interrupters. So Joyce gives us more, so we get more in Joyce. And the question was really if there's any real understanding of why he does that, why the episode is where it is, why he might have done it, right? So it is a book of obviously 18 chapters, and chapter 10 is right there in the middle of it. It has 19 micro narratives, so we get into the sort of minutiae here. And you can do this. This is a very technical exercise. I always do this with my students. When you break it down, look at these individual micro narratives. There's a particular kind of pattern. That's the section in the middle focuses on Leopold Bloom. So everything comes closer and closer to Leopold Bloom in the very, very middle of the book. It's very carefully designed in that way. So that's really how the episode works. And I think that was clearly designed by Joyce in this way. It's very technical, but there's a particular structure that I think Joyce plans. And that's why he also needed the Wandering Rocks episode there, right in the middle. I think that one, yes. I would like to say that, yes, that certainly is very, very careful. Yeah.
Can I go ahead?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
So, and it's partly because of Simon Edwards, which is, and he's hardly here would have that moment at some point. And I'm going to use a provocative word because I want to see how we think about it, and that's vulgarity, which is something that the novel was accused of, because it does talk about those things that 19th century novels do not. Despite being realist novels, people don't go to the toilet. People they don't belch, they don't fart, they don't urinate, and so on. And I just wonder what is Joyce doing with those?
Mm.
Because there's a little bit of mischief, I think,
Yeah.
bit of schoolboy humor.
Mm.
But I think there's also there must be a sort of deeper artistic purpose behind it, and I just wonder what you think of the vulgarity.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Presumably, do you want me to? I don't need to repeat that question, right?
Possibly, just
Fine. Just very briefly. But so the question from Ian was the question about the vulgarity of the text. That there is a certain level of vulgarity that Joyce is including. Is it just schoolboy humor, or is there some deeper artistic purpose behind it? I think that was the question, right? So the humor definitely is there, but I would have thought that in his mid-30s, maybe Joyce is beyond the age where he would, develop that kind of humor. Although, that's that. Who knows? I don't know. But I think more generally, I think he was very, very influenced by writers like George Bernard Shaw, Henrik Ibsen, so the naturalist writers as well, who wanted to make sure that literature art is actually presenting a more realistic view of life in not in all of its ugly details. And this is certainly an element of the text that we encounter everywhere, that he felt that this is part of life. This is part of life and it can't be excluded. It belongs into a sort of very complete picture of everyday life, of ordinary life, everyday people's lives. And so it has to be included in a novel that wants to give that kind of representation of life in Dublin at the beginning of the 20th century. So that really is, I think, a very quick and straightforward answer to that question, that it is part of that project.
There's a question here on the chat as well, which is about the close reading here.
Right.
It was just whether you thought there was anything significant about the kind of pattern of unsaluted, undecided, changed her plan, stood in mid-street.
Oh, okay.
Which would be in on chat.
So unsaluted,
undecided, changed her plan, stood in mid-street.
Well, I will just throw back that question to the questioner. Is there a particular suggestion or particular?
Not here at the moment. Maybe in the chat.
Because I think these are often these kind of observations that you suddenly begin to realize when you see a passage in isolation. I've never thought about it. So that's something that I never noticed. But this is always the fun, reading Joyce. I mean, Joyce is often best read in a reading group. I don't know if anyone has had that experience of reading Joyce Ulysses with a group of others. It's absolutely brilliant because it's my good friend Fritz Zen, the director of the Zurich James Joyce Foundation, says if nothing else, it just makes you feel better if everybody else just simply doesn't get it either, right? So that's already good. But the other thing is that together, collectively, there's a better way of finding out new things about the text, about Ulysses, if you read it together, because everybody has particular associations, everybody has a different set of skills and knowledge systems, and that can bring out really, really productive readings here. So unsaluted, undecided. I'm still, thinking about it. What could be? I mean,
technique for that is now.
Yes. It is also. I mean, in many ways, here we have that sort of sense of the labyrinth here in some of the sentences that we read out. But the labyrinth is also a comment on the episode itself, which, as I suggested before, looks at Dublin, different individuals moving around in Dublin city centre, like a labyrinth. But I think you're right. It's probably also something to do with the syntactical constructions. I'm sure there's some sense in it, but I don't have the answer to it. But that's the best thing as well. If you work on Joyce, there's often just this moment where you just say, I just don't. That's perfectly fine.
Does it link with the idea of wandering?
Yes.
So that sounds sort of
Undecided. Yes, steering. I mean, there's lots of lots of words that indicate obviously movement in this episode. Steering his way from the greenhouse, stood still, lack of movement. I think there is obviously this is an episode that is very, 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 very energetic. You've got the Leonardo schema in front of you there. The organ's glass, isn't it? Which again, is that right? Blood, isn't it? Blood. So that again indicates the kind of sense of circulation within the city. I think that's partly, something to do with that as well. Yeah.
Question. Yeah, thank you. I'm really enjoying this evening.
Thank you.
My question is, do you think that Ulysses may begin this last sentence, i.e. the yes, which is hiding in plain sight in the title, and she is saying yes to somebody called Gardner at the next door wall, and I don't know, you can say the elemental Molly Bloom is the moon, is woman, etc., but I don't know the idea that she may be Eve. And that it's a fall, and when we start with human corruption and the devil on his tower. It's only an idea. Just wonder what you thought.
Yes, I love this when people just come up with fabulous new, readings of Ulysses that I haven't heard. That's really lovely. I would say, the thing I would say to you in support of your reading, your arguments, I don't know if you have looked at Finnegan's Wake, is the book that he writes afterwards. Has anyone had a look at Finnegan's Wake? What's that? A couple of people in the back there. Yes. Verdict?
The river runs.
It leads. You want to explain it? Because that's precisely maybe that sense that the last word is the first word. It's circular. So it ends on, as Joyce suggested, the weakest words in the English language, so mid-sentence. And then if you begin the first word is river run. So the idea is that you end the book and you begin again at the beginning. It sort of loops around. It has therefore no ending, which might seem very terrifying, especially if you encountered passages from Finnegan's Wake, where Joyce breaks away from kind of understanding of normal English language. Right? Anyone who's had a look, you know exactly what I mean. It's already about over 600 pages, and the idea that you just start again, there's no way out, and it's circular, might be quite terrifying. Right? So there's a reason why loads of academics spend their lives working on this one particular book. Should say there's a difference between us normal Joyceans, like people like me who do loads of other things, and then the people we call the Wakeans, the Finnegan's Wake scholars. They do very little else. I said that I'm not one of them. But this is again in support of the reading. The question is how there's a certain circularity in Ulysses itself. And I think that is something that fascinates Joyce. Even already the sense of return, he returns to the Odyssey, right, in his novel. So that's that fascination to return to certain topics. He returns, as suggested at the beginning, Stephen is returned to Dublin. We see him in a portrait. He reappears in Ulysses. Joyce is not quite done with him, so he appears. Also some figures and characters from his collection, Dubliners, also reappear in Ulysses. He just likes recycling things quite a lot if they worked for him. So that is a very significant pattern in Joyce, not just in Ulysses.
A question online, a very simple question. Could you describe the major themes of scholarship for this book? Have they changed over the 100 years? So in 2 minutes or 3 minutes, how would you characterise how scholarship of the novel has changed, essentially?
Well, there's different stages. So the early scholarship, I would say, really focused on the literary techniques. Maybe taking the symbol starting point, thinking through this. What does it mean? That was sort of the very early days. Certainly also a fair amount of biographical criticism. It's obviously very, very important. In this particular reading, the young Stephen Dedalus is always seen as a suggested, a thinly disguised version of Joyce himself. I think we've now moved away from that because I think anyone has, well, I have very little patience with Stephen, put it this way, so I can't understand why Joyce would have thought of Stephen as a good way of representing himself in his novels, but that's something else. Then there was a certain time where I think criticism focused very much on the Homeric references. Beyond that, there was a big, strong post-structuralist moment in Joyce scholarship that's very academic. Basically, it's a particular kind of scholarship that really just celebrates this text and Joyce's other works as just explorations of literary language, what you can do with literary language, right? A celebration of that. In the 1990s, we've got the post-colonial turn. So this is when scholars begin to be interested in Joyce's depiction of Ireland as a colonial city. And, this is where more political and also more historicist readings of Joyce develop. So this is also where my own scholarship on Joyce begins. So Ian said at the beginning, I wrote a book on Joyce and medicine. So I looked very much at the way in which Joyce picks up on and maybe also challenges particular medical narratives that were developed at the time. So that's sort of post-colonial historicist Joyce that develops. Then, have I got still a couple of seconds, like 2 minutes? Not even yet in the new millennium. So a particular type of scholarship, it's called geneticist scholarship. These are scholars who excessively go back to draft and manuscript materials. What I didn't speak about is that the fact that Joyce, I said he wrote this novel, but it took him 7 years to finish it. But he excessively rewrote the text. He had notebooks, drafts, and in particular manuscript forms, typescripts. It's suggested that he wrote about 30% of the novel at proof stage. So you can imagine what the proofs might have looked like. So there's all that material that we have, the pre-publication material, and Joyce scholars are beginning to be fascinated by looking at the process of how Joyce wrote Ulysses. So how do we get from the earliest notebooks to the completed text? What are the different stages? It is particularly interesting, again, something I didn't mention before, is that the final text, when it was published in 1922, was full of mistakes. So I said it was published in Paris, and apparently Joyce had a typist who was not fluent in English. So that certainly didn't help, especially when you think of a novel as complex as Ulysses. And apparently Joyce got so frustrated and repeatedly having to correct certain mistakes that repeatedly came back that at some point he just decided they just have to stay, right? That is anecdotal, but certainly the first published version was full of mistakes. And in the 1980s, a team of scholars went back to all the manuscript material and tried to reconstruct the text as Joyce actually intended it. So this is the so-called Ulysses, the corrected text, which a number of German scholars worked on the project. So that still is a type of scholarship of Joyce that is very, very much alive. It is helped by the fact that Joyce is now out of copyright, or his texts are now out of copyright. So suddenly we have loads of online edition hypertexts that can be developed, where you can imagine how amazing it is, because in a hypertext version you can insert notes more directly into an online text. It's expandable. Loads of people can add to the notes for Ulysses, because that's a particular type of scholarship that is very, very dominant still, I would say, probably the most dominant. And then there are various other ways in which Joyce threads eco-criticism, animal studies. The good thing about Joyce is his novel is encyclopedic. You can be sure that you probably will find a reference to almost everything in there. So it's a happy hunting ground for any kind of academic who wants a long life in academia, I think.
That's it. Walking to a conclusion that any shifts ending. So I want to first thank Vike for a fantastic talk. I myself am a professor of English too, which is always, I think, a little bit intimidating to have a fellow colleague in the room. And I wish Vike was there when I started reading Ulysses as an undergraduate. I still remember trying to get through what must have been chapter 2 and trying to figure out what ineluctable meant. And it just, see, that's been trauma that still lives with me.
Yes.
So to clarify and to de-obfuscate kind of Joycean terms is a remarkable thing. So if we could just put our hands together to thank Vike.
Can I just say one final thing? If anyone is interested in reading Ulysses, a very, very good guide for anybody who's a first-time reader is Terence Killeen's book Ulysses Unbound. Fabulous introduction. Terence Killeen, Ulysses Unbound. Anyone, let's have a go. So that's all.
Thank you, Anita. And just before we go, I'm just going to do this quite there. It's easier than holding this. Just to, if this wasn't enough, I mean, this is enough, but if this wasn't enough, over the next month or so, we have first on Wednesday, the big read, 11 o'clock in the morning here, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Bronte, so another novelist, but 19th century. On next Monday, a colleague of Vike's from Exeter, Adam Watt, is coming up to talk about another big literary beast, reading Proust. So that's next Monday evening. Then on Saturday, the 15th of October, we have the Victorian Fiction Discussion Group, focusing on The Woman in White, which is a great and really kind of thrilling novel. That's Saturday the 15th at 11 in the morning. Later that day, we go from Woman in White to Jane Austen and London, Scene of Dissipation and Vice. And that's at 3 o'clock on Saturday the 15th. I'm getting there. Then we move into the modernist era with Eliot, the big read, and we're focusing on The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. So that's the 19th of October, 11 o'clock here. And then finally, I'm running out of paper here. It feels like I'm writing Joyce. Bath's Gothic Fiction. We have some flyers here. A day-long programme of talks on October the 22nd, Saturday, with speakers including Amy Frost, Andrew Smith, Sheila Hannon, Chris Harris, Professor Robert Morrison, a colleague of mine at Bath Spa, and Sir Christopher Frayling. Betty is ringmaster for that. And if any of you want the flyers for that, I have them here. So we have a huge offering of literary events taking place in the next month. So I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible at least one of those events in the coming weeks. But thank you again for your time this evening. Thank you, Vike. And we'll let you go on into the streets of Bath. Thank you.